Good day, lovely viewers. Welcome to Potter Vibes. We have an exciting story lined up for you today. Andromeda and Narcissa Black reunited for the first time in 20 years, to declare war on Dumbledore together. Your engagement means the world to us. Like, comment, and subscribe to help us grow and bring you more amazing content. Without wasting any time, let's start. Chapter 1, Blood will tell the rain did not fall, it drove itself into the earth like iron nails. Inside the healing sanctum at the back of the Tonks cottage, the air was thick with the scent of crushed didney, ozone, and the sharp, coppery tang of failing magic. Andromeda stood over the examination table, her wand moving in tight, economical arcs. She did not flick her wrist. She did not use the broad, sweeping gestures taught at St. Mungo's. Her movements were precise, almost surgical, pulling threads of ambient warmth into the pale, shivering form of her daughter. Nymphadora's hair, usually a riotous cascade of bubblegum pink or violent violet, was stuck in a sickly, translucent gray. It was the color of old ash. Every few seconds, a spasm would rack her body, and a patch of her skin would ripple, trying to shift, trying to adapt to the pain, but the metamorphomagus ability was misfiring. Her left eye would briefly turn a reptilian yellow before snapping back to its natural dark brown, the transition leaving her eyelid bruised and swollen. "Hold the line, Dora," Andromeda murmured, her voice a low, steady hum meant to anchor the girl's drifting consciousness. "Just hold the line. I've got the perimeter." She pressed two fingers to the pulse point on Dora's neck. The skin was fever hot, but beneath it, the magical core felt wrong. Healing was not merely about mending flesh, it was about listening to the song of a person's magic and coaxing it back into harmony. Dora's psalm was fracturing. It sounded like glass grinding against stone. There was a void in her center, a cold, methodical emptiness that was drinking her magic faster than Andromeda could replenish it. Andromeda adjusted her grip on her wand, switching from a standard stabilizing charm to a deeper, older weaving. She drew on the reserves of her own core, letting her magic flow down her arm, through the hawthorn wood, and into Dora's chest. For a moment, the gray in Dora's hair flushed with a faint, ghostly pink. Her breathing eased. Then, the void snapped back. It didn't just consume the magic Andromeda offered, it pulled, hard, sending a shockwave of cold up Andromeda's arm that made her teeth ache. Dora gasped, her back arching off the table, the gray spreading from her hair down to her lips. "No, you don't," Andromeda hissed. She slammed her free hand flat against Dora's sternum, acting as a physical conduit, forcing her own vitality into the gap. "You do not take her. You don't get to have her." She held the connection until her vision blurred at the edges, until sweat stung her eyes and her knees threatened to buckle. Slowly, agonizingly, the pull receded, settling back into a dormant, parasitic hum. Dora slumped back onto the linens, unconscious but breathing steadily. The gray in her hair remained, but the violent rippling of her skin stopped. Andromeda stepped back, her chest heaving. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of soot across her cheek. She looked at the array of potions cooling on the side table. Blood replenisher, essence of dittany, a modified draft of peace laced with powdered moonstone. None of it was touching the root of the problem. St. Mungo's had called it a rare magical autoimmune response. They had offered platitudes and mild sedatives. Andromeda had taken her daughter home on the second day, knowing the hospital's standardized magic would only feed the thing inside Dora. It had been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching her vibrant, chaotic, brilliant daughter wither into a ghost. 3 weeks of Ted working double shifts at the ministry to afford the rare ingredients, coming home with hollow eyes, pretending he wasn't terrified. Andromeda turned away from the table, moving to the small iron sink to wash her hands. The water was freezing. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of that cold, mechanical void. She was a black. She had been trained in the most rigorous, unforgiving magical disciplines before she had ever touched a standard healing text. She knew dark magic, she knew light magic, and she knew the gray spaces in between. But this? This was none of those. It felt sterile. It felt intentional. A sound cut through the drumming of the rain. Andromeda froze, the water still running over her hands. It wasn't a knock. It was a resonance. The blood wards woven into the foundation of the cottage, wards she had cast herself and keyed to only 3 people, herself, Ted, and Dora, were singing. But it wasn't the warm, welcoming chime of family returning. It was a low, dissonant hum, a vibration that she felt in her molars before she heard it with her ears. Someone was at the boundary. Someone whose blood matched the ancient, iron-heavy signature of the House of Black. Andromeda turned off the tap. She dried her hands on a towel with slow, deliberate movements. She did not rush. Rushing was for the panicked, and panic was a luxury she had discarded 20 years ago. She walked to the heavy oak cabinet beside the fireplace, bypassed the standard dueling wands, and withdrew a slender, pale piece of bone-white wood. You. Unforgiving. She slipped it into the sleeve of her robes. She walked through the darkened cottage. The living room was quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Ted was asleep in the armchair, an open book on magical law resting on his chest. She paused, casting a silent, localized silencing charm around him so he wouldn't wake, then continued to the front door. The hum of the wards was stronger here. It was a plea, not an attack. The magic was recognizing a sibling frequency, confused by the presence of a signature that had been stricken from the family tapestry but still flowed in the veins. Andromeda placed her hand on the iron latch. She took a breath, letting her acclimancy shield slide into place, smoothing her features into a mask of polite, impenetrable indifference. She pulled the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from her grasp, bringing with it a sheet of freezing rain. Andromeda stood firm, her eyes adjusting to the gloom of the porch. A figure stood on the top step. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain plastered the woman's pale blonde hair to her skull, stripping away the immaculate, towering coiffure that was her armor. Her robes were acromantula silk, worth more than the Tonks cottage, but the hem was caked in mud, the fabric clinging to her legs, ruined. She was shivering, though her posture remained rigidly, defiantly straight. In her arms, she held a boy. He was perhaps 16, his limbs long and awkward, his face the same sharp, aristocratic porcelain as the woman holding him. His eyes were closed, his skin possessing the same terrifying, translucent gray pallor that Andromeda had been fighting for 3 weeks. Narcissa Malfoy looked up. Her eyes, usually so cold and assessing, were wide, the pupils blown out with a terror she could no longer conceal. Water dripped from her eyelashes. She looked at Andromeda, her lips parting, but no sound came out. She swallowed, her throat working, fighting through 2 decades of silence, pride, and ideological warfare. "Andy," she whispered. The nickname was a ghost, a relic from a nursery in Grimmauld Place, spoken in a voice cracked by the cold. "Please." Andromeda looked at her sister. She looked at the mud on the silk. She looked at the boy in her arms. The acclimancy shields held, but beneath them, something ancient and dormant cracked. "Bring him in," Andromeda said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth the word "please" deserved, but she stepped aside, holding the door wide. Narcissa crossed the threshold. As she passed, the air between them crackled, the residual magic of their shared bloodline reacting to the proximity after so long. Narcissa stumbled slightly on the rug, her strength failing now that she was out of the storm. Andromeda's hand shot out, catching her sister by the elbow. The grip was firm, clinical. Narcissa flinched, then leaned into the support for a fraction of a second before righting herself. "The kitchen," Andromeda directed, letting go. "The table is clear. Lay him down." Narcissa carried Draco into the kitchen, moving with the careful, measured steps of someone carrying glass. She lowered him onto the scarred wooden table. The contrast was jarring, the dark, lived-in wood of the Tonks home beneath the pale, pristine form of the Malfoy heir. Narcissa stepped back, her hands hovering over him, trembling violently. She clasped them together, forcing them still, her knuckles white. Andromeda closed the front door, locking it with a flick of her wand, and followed them into the kitchen. She didn't offer tea. She didn't offer a towel. She walked to the table and looked down at her nephew. She had seen him only in photographs in the Daily Prophet. A sneering boy in Slytherin green, standing beside a father who looked at the world as if it owed him a debt. But the boy on the table wasn't sneering. He was dying. How long? Andromeda asked, drawing her hawthorn wand. 3 weeks, Narcissa said. Her voice was steadier now, the aristocratic cadence returning as a shield. It started as fatigue. Then the fevers. His magic, it began to leak. He couldn't hold a simple lumos without his hands shaking. The healers at St. Mungo's said it was magical exhaustion. They gave him restorative drafts. Idiots, Andromeda muttered. She began casting the same diagnostic web she had used on Dora. Golden threads of light spun from her wand, wrapping around Draco's chest, sinking into his skin. St. Mungo's treats the symptom, never the architecture. They look at the river and ignore the dam. I took him to a specialist in France, Narcissa continued, her eyes tracking Andromeda's wand movements with a hawkish intensity. A blood magic practitioner. He refused to treat him. Said the boy's core was compromised. He told me to make him comfortable. The last word fractured. Narcissa's composure slipped, revealing the raw, bleeding edge beneath. I will not make him comfortable, Andy. I will not watch him fade. Andromeda didn't look up. The golden threads turned a sickly, bruised purple as they mapped Draco's internal state. She felt the exact same cold, mechanical void she had felt in Dora. It was sitting in the center of his chest, a parasite made of frost and geometry, quietly siphoning his power. It's the same, Andromeda said softly. Narcissa went still. What is? Andromeda finally looked at her sister. Dora. She's in the back room. She's been like this for 3 weeks. The gray skin. The failing core. The void that drinks standard healing magic and spits it back as ice. She pointed her wand at Draco's chest. Look at the etheric scarring. It's identical. Not similar. Identical. Like they were stamped with the same seal. Narcissa stepped closer, peering at the purple light. She was not a healer, but she was a black. She knew how to read the shape of magic. She saw the rigid, unnatural lines of the decay. This is not a disease, she murmured. No, Andromeda agreed. It's an extraction. Silence fell over the kitchen, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rain lashing against the windowpanes and the shallow breathing of the boy on the table. Who? Narcissa asked. The word was a blade. All the vulnerability she had shown on the porch was gone, replaced by a cold, focused lethality that Andromeda remembered from their childhood. When Bellatrix had been the storm, Narcissa had been the ice beneath it. I don't know, Andromeda said, lowering her wand. I've tried everything. Standard healing, deep tissue ether mending, even some of the old counter curses we learned from Aunt Walburga. Nothing touches it. It's shielded. Whoever did this wove the siphon so deeply into his magical signature that removing it would tear his core apart. Lucius thinks it's a late maturation, Narcissa said, her lip curling in a brief, bitter sneer. He thinks Draco is simply struggling to contain the Malfoy power. He forbade me from seeking outside help, said it would show weakness to the Dark Lord Circle. She looked at Andromeda, her gray eyes hard. I lied to my husband. I told him I was taking Draco to a spa in the Alps for his nerves. If Lucius finds out I am here. He won't, Andromeda said. The cottage is under a Fidelius, and I am the secret keeper. To the rest of the world, this house does not exist. You are safe from your husband here, Chissa. The use of the childhood name made Narcissa flinch. She looked away, her gaze falling on the scarred wood of the table. Why did you let me in, Andy? After everything. After the tapestry. After Mother. Because you said, please, Andromeda said simply. She turned to the cupboards, pulling out a jar of dried silverleaf and a mortar. And because you were holding a dying child. I left the House of Black, Narcissa. I didn't leave my humanity. She began to crush the silverleaf, the rhythmic grinding filling the silence. Narcissa watched her, her eyes tracing the lines of Andromeda's face, the practical cut of her robes, the absence of the heavy, suffocating jewelry their mother had insisted upon. You look tired, Narcissa observed quietly. I'm fighting a war on a microscopic scale, every hour of every day, Andromeda replied, not looking up. I'm allowed to look tired. I meant, you look like you've been fighting for a long time. 20 years, Andromeda said. She stopped grinding and leaned her hands on the counter, looking at her sister. 20 years of proving that I didn't make a mistake. 20 years of looking over my shoulder, wondering if one of your husband's friends was going to decide I was a loose end. You want to talk about the tapestry? You want to talk about the silence? Fine. But not tonight. Tonight, we figure out what is killing our children. Narcissa nodded slowly, accepting the boundary. She moved to the table, gently brushing a damp strand of hair from Draco's forehead. When did it start for Nymphadora? Exactly. 3 weeks ago, Tuesday, Andromeda said. She was on an aura training exercise. Came home complaining of a headache. By midnight, her hair wouldn't change color. By morning, the fever started. Draco was at Hogwarts, Narcissa said, her mind working rapidly, connecting the timelines. He came home for the weekend. He was fine on Friday. By Sunday evening, he couldn't stand. Hogwarts, Andromeda mused. Dora graduated years ago. What is the common denominator? It can't be the location. Think, Andy, Narcissa urged, her voice taking on the sharp, analytical tone they used to use when plotting how to avoid their mother's wrath. Not location. Attention. Who has had access to both of them? Who has the power to weave a siphon this deep and mask it from St. Mungo's? Andromeda frowned, leaning against the counter. Dora is an auror. She interacts with half the ministry. Draco is a student. The only person who overlaps in a position of authority is. She trailed off. A cold feeling, entirely unrelated to the magic in the room, began to pool in her stomach. Narcissa looked up, her eyes narrowing. What? 3 years ago, Andromeda said slowly. Dora was still at Hogwarts. Dumbledore visited our home. He said he was doing wellness checks on students with highly volatile magical profiles. Metamorph magi, seers, those with elemental affinities. He said Dora's shifting was drawing too much ambient magic, that she was at risk of a core burnout. He offered to stabilize her. Narcissa's breath hitched. He placed his hand on her head. Yes, Andromeda said, the memory suddenly sharp, suddenly sinister. A golden light. Dora said it felt like drinking cold water on a hot day. She slept for 12 hours afterward, but when she woke, her control was perfect. Better than perfect. I thought he was helping. She looked at Narcissa, her face pale. What about Draco? Last year, Narcissa whispered. After his sorting. Dumbledore called him to his office. He said Draco had a unique resonance, a potential for great things, but that his core was unbalanced. He gave him a silver phial. A potion, he said, to harmonize his magical pathways. Draco drank it in front of him. A golden light for Dora. A silver potion for Draco, Andromeda said. Different delivery methods, but the same underlying architecture. He anchored the siphon to the moment of stabilization. Why? Narcissa demanded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Why would Albus Dumbledore, the paragon of the light, do this to children? What possible gain could he have? I don't know, Andromeda said. Standard diagnostics can't show us the source. They only show the effect. If we want to know what this is, we have to look at the tether itself. We have to trace the siphon back to its anchor. Narcissa looked at her. How? You just said St. Mungos can't see it. Your deep sight charms can't see it. Because standard charms ask the magic for permission, Andromeda said. She pushed off the counter and walked toward the center of the kitchen. With a flick of her wand, she pushed the heavy oak table, with Draco still on it, a few feet to the left, clearing a space on the floor. We aren't going to ask. She knelt on the wooden floorboards. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, murmuring a word in a language that sounded like grinding stones. The floorboards groaned, then slid apart, revealing a hidden compartment lined with lead. Inside lay a single book. It was bound in black dragon hide, the edges of the pages stained dark with age and use. There was no title on the spine, only a silver clasp shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. Narcissa took a step back, her face draining of what little color it had left. Andy. No. Mother burned that. Mother tried, Andromeda said, lifting the book from the compartment. It was heavy, thrumming with a dormant, hungry energy. She burned the copy in the family library. She didn't know Grandfather Arcturus had given me the original before I ran away. He knew I was the only one who actually read the theory instead of just memorizing the incantations. The sanguis veritatis, Narcissa breathed. It's blood magic. Deep blood magic. It's banned by the ministry. It's banned by the order. If you use that. The ministry isn't here, Andromeda said, placing the book on the floor and unclasping it. The pages fell open, the parchment whispering like dry leaves. And the order wouldn't believe me if I told them their golden boy is siphoning my daughter. I am not asking for permission, Chissa. I am asking for results. She looked up at her sister. I can't do this alone. The spell requires a blood anchor to trace a familial magical signature. Dora is too weak to provide it. I need someone with the black bloodline to anchor the tracing, someone whose core is stable. Narcissa stared at the book. She had been raised to fear this magic. Bellatrix had reveled in it, using it to inflict pain, to dominate. Narcissa had always viewed it as a stain, a dark thing that corrupted the user. She had married Lucius partly to escape the shadow of Grimmauld Place, to wrap herself in the clean, sanctioned power of the Malfoy name. But the Malfoy name had not saved her son. The sanctioned power of St. Mungos had not saved him. She looked at Draco, his chest rising and falling in that terrible, shallow rhythm. Then she looked at Andromeda, kneeling on the floor, offering her the very thing Narcissa had spent her life running from. What do I have to do? Narcissa asked. Kneel opposite me, Andromeda instructed. Give me your left hand. Narcissa moved gracefully, sinking to the floor. She extended her hand. Her skin was cold, her fingers long and elegant, devoid of the heavy rings she usually wore. Andromeda took her hand. The physical contact sent a jolt through both of them, a sudden, overwhelming rush of shared memory. The smell of the greenhouse at Grimmauld Place. The sound of rain on the manor roof. The feeling of hiding under the covers while Bellatrix screamed at the house elves. Andromeda pushed the memories down. She drew her wand and, without hesitation, drew the tip across the palm of Narcissa's hand. Narcissa didn't flinch. A line of bright crimson welled up. Andromeda did the same to her own palm, then pressed their bleeding hands together, interlacing their fingers over the open pages of the grimoire. Focus on Draco, Andromeda commanded, her voice dropping into the resonant, commanding tone of a ritualist. Focus on the shape of his magic. Do not look at the decay. Look at the boy. Anchor him. Narcissa closed her eyes. She pictured Draco as a toddler, chasing peacocks in the gardens. She pictured his first wand, the hawthorn and unicorn hair. She built the image of her son in her mind, making it solid, making it real. Andromeda began to chant. The words were not Latin. They were older, guttural, vibrating in the chest rather than the throat. The kitchen grew instantly cold. The fire in the hearth snapped and turned a bruised, violet color. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched, detaching themselves from the walls and leaning toward the sisters. The blood between their palms began to heat, turning from liquid to something akin to molten light. It seeped down into the pages of the grimoire, the parchment drinking it greedily. Andromeda felt the pull. It was like stepping off a cliff into a rushing river. The magic of the spell seized her consciousness, using her blood and Narcissa's as a compass. She felt Dora in the next room, a flickering candle. She felt Draco on the table, a dying star. And then, she felt the tethers. Show me, she commanded the magic. Show me the architect. The kitchen dissolved. Andromeda and Narcissa were no longer in the cottage. They were standing in a vast, etheric space, a representation of the magical ley lines of Britain. But it was not the wild, chaotic web Andromeda was used to seeing. It was ordered. Terrifyingly, brutally ordered. Massive pillars of golden light stretched from the earth to the sky, forming a geometric lattice of immense proportions. It was a cage, or perhaps a dam, holding back some unseen, roiling pressure in the deep magic of the world. The structure was beautiful in its symmetry, but it was hungry. Andromeda followed the tether attached to Draco and Dora. It was a thin, silver thread, nearly invisible against the golden pillars, but it pulsed with a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. It drew power from the children, carrying it up, 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 feeding it into the grand lattice. Look, Narcissa's voice echoed in the space, tight with awe and horror. At the center of the lattice, where all the lines converged, stood a figure. It was an etheric projection, vast and luminous. Albus Dumbledore. But not the twinkling-eyed grandfather the public knew. This was Dumbledore as a creature of pure magical architecture. He stood with his hands raised, conducting the flow of power like a maestro. His face was serene, utterly devoid of malice. He was not torturing the children. He was pruning a garden. He was maintaining the structural integrity of a ward so massive it defied comprehension, and the children were simply the mortar he was using to fill the cracks. He took a fraction of Dora's chaotic, shifting power to stabilize a fluctuating node in the north. He took a measure of Draco's pure, aristocratic core to reinforce a failing pillar in the south. He did it with the casual, detached efficiency of a god adjusting the stars. The greater balance, the magic whispered to them, the intent of the spell bleeding into their minds. The many sustained by the few. The volatile contained. The necessary sacrifice. He doesn't see them as people, Narcissa whispered, her etheric form trembling. He sees them as components. He sees them as fuel, Andromeda corrected, her voice hard as diamond. He thinks he's saving the world, Chissa. And he thinks the cost is justified because he's the one doing the math. The projection of Dumbledore shifted, his head turning slightly, as if sensing the intrusion. A wave of immense, crushing pressure rolled toward them. The golden light flared, blinding and hot. Break the connection. Andromeda shouted. She wrenched her hand from Narcissa's, severing the blood link. The etheric space shattered like a mirror. They were thrown back into their bodies with the force of a physical blow. Andromeda gasped, falling backward onto the kitchen floor, her chest heaving as she dragged air into her starved lungs. The fire in the hearth snapped back to orange. The shadows retreated. The grimoire slammed shut, the silver clasp locking with a sharp click. Narcissa remained on her knees, her head bowed, her breathing ragged. Blood dripped from her left hand onto the floorboards, stark and red. Andromeda pushed herself up. Her hands were shaking. She crawled over to Narcissa, grabbing a clean cloth from the counter, and wrapped it tightly around her sister's bleeding palm. She muttered a quick healing charm, sealing the cut. Narcissa didn't pull away. She let Andromeda bind her hand. When the wrapping was secure, she slowly raised her head. Her gray eyes were entirely black in the dim light, the pupils still dilated from the vision. "He is the chief warlock," Narcissa said. Her voice was eerily calm, the calm of a frozen lake right before the ice gives way. "He is the supreme mugwump. He is the only one the Dark Lord ever feared. The entire magical world rests on the belief that he is the absolute moral authority." "He is a parasite," Andromeda said, wiping the blood from her own hand. "A parasite with a savior complex." "Lucius would never believe it," Narcissa said. "The Death Eaters would see this as a weakness in Draco, not a victimization. They would cast him aside." "And your order?" "My order worships the ground he walks on," Andromeda said bitterly. "If I go to them, they'll say I'm paranoid. They'll say I'm letting my black family prejudices cloud my judgment. They'll say Dumbledore would never harm a child, and they will look at me with pity while my daughter dies." She stood up, pacing the small length of the kitchen. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. For 20 years, she had tried to be good. She had tried to play by the rules of the light, to heal, to love, to distance herself from the darkness of her birth. She had believed that if she was good enough, the world would be fair. The world was not fair. And the man running it was eating her child. "We can't go to the authorities," Andromeda said, stopping her pacing and looking at Narcissa. "We can't go to the press. He controls the narrative. He controls the institutions." "Then what do we do?" Narcissa asked. She stood up, smoothing her ruined silk robes with a mechanical precision. The terrified mother from the porch was gone. In her place was a woman who had just been shown the face of the enemy, and was calculating the most efficient way to slit his throat. "We do what we were trained to do," Andromeda said. "We use the things they don't expect. They expect us to be a blood traitor and a submissive pure-blood wife. They expect us to be isolated. They don't expect us to be together." Narcissa looked at the grimoire on the floor. "You want to fight him with blood magic." "I want to fight him with everything," Andromeda said. "I want to tear that lattice apart, thread by thread, until his precious, greater balance, collapses. I want to sever the tethers without killing the children. And then, I want to make him bleed." "It will be dangerous," Narcissa said softly. "If he senses us again." "Then we make sure he doesn't," Andromeda said. "We mask our signatures. We use the old ways. The untraceable ways. We have access to resources he doesn't know about. You have the Malfoy library. You have the social access. I have the healing knowledge and the black grimoires. We can dismantle this from the inside." Narcissa looked at Draco, then toward the closed door of the back room where Dora lay. She walked over to the table and placed her uninjured hand on Draco's cheek. "I have spent my entire life being what men told me to be," Narcissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father told me to be quiet. Lucius told me to be elegant. The Dark Lord told me to be obedient. Dumbledore told me my son was harmonized. She turned to look at Andromeda. "I am done being told." Andromeda felt a fierce, sudden pride swell in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since they were girls, plotting their small rebellions in the dark. "We need to stabilize them first," Andromeda said, shifting into logistics. "The blood spell showed me the shape of the siphon. Now that I know how it's anchored, I can build a bypass. It won't cure them, but it will stop the drain. It will buy us time." "How long?" "Months, if I maintain the wards daily. But we have to find the physical anchors. The golden light, the silver phial. There will be a residue, a focal point on their bodies where the tether attaches. Draco has a small, silver scar on his collarbone, Narcissa said immediately. It appeared the morning after he drank the potion. The healers said it was a magical blemish. Dora has a golden freckle behind her left ear, Andromeda said, the pieces falling into place. I thought it was just a remnant of her shifting. We sever the physical anchor while you maintain the bypass, Narcissa said. But we must be careful. If Dumbledore notices the flow of power stopping, he will investigate. Let him, Andromeda said, a dangerous smile touching her lips. Let him look for a dark wizard. Let him look for a Death Eater plot. He will never look for two sisters having tea in a cottage that doesn't exist. Narcissa walked over to where Andromeda stood. She reached out and, with a tentative, almost hesitant movement, touched Andromeda's arm. The silk of her sleeve was damp, but her grip was firm. I am sorry, Andy, she said. The words were quiet, stripped of all artifice. For the tapestry. For the years. I was afraid. I chose safety over you. Andromeda looked at her sister's hand, then up to her eyes. You chose survival, Chissa. We all did. But we're not surviving anymore. We're going to war. Narcissa nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. Then we will need better tea than whatever you have in that tin. And I will need to borrow a dry cloak. I cannot declare war looking like a drowned measle. Andromeda let out a short, startled laugh. It felt rusty in her throat, but genuine. Second drawer in the hall closet. There's a green wool one. It will swallow you, but it's warm. As Narcissa turned to fetch the cloak, Andromeda moved back to the table. She began to prepare the bypass ritual, her mind racing with arithmetic equations, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had been forged into a weapon. She looked at Draco, then toward the door where Dora slept. They were not just victims. They were the catalyst. Dumbledore had made a fatal miscalculation. He had looked at the magical world and seen pieces on a chessboard. He had forgotten that the pieces had mothers. And he had certainly forgotten what happened when the House of Black decided to stop playing by the rules. The rain continued to beat against the cottage, but inside, the air had changed. The sterile, mechanical cold of the siphon was being pushed back, inch by inch, by the hot, iron-heavy magic of two sisters who had finally remembered how to stand together. The war for the greater balance had begun, not with a roar, but with the quiet, methodical grinding of silverleaf in a mortar, and the unbreakable promise of blood. Chapter 2, The Greater Balance. Dawn did not break over the Tonks cottage, it bruised the sky, bleeding a dull, aching purple through the heavy clouds. Inside the kitchen, the air was still thick with the ozone tang of the blood ritual, but the frantic, jagged energy of the night had settled into a steady, humming vibration. Andromeda sat in a wooden chair beside the table, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on Draco's chest. The bypass was holding. She had woven a secondary etheric loop, a detour for his magic that fed the siphon a synthetic resonance drawn from the ambient ley lines beneath the cottage, rather than his own core. It was a fragile thing, spun from gossamer threads of intent and anchored by the iron will of her own magical signature. Every time Draco inhaled, she felt the phantom tug against her sternum. Across the table, Narcissa sat perfectly still. She had not moved for 3 hours. The green wool cloak Andromeda had lent her was pulled tight around her shoulders, swallowing her slender frame. Her face was pale, the aristocratic sharpness of her features softened by exhaustion, but her eyes were wide open, tracking the rise and fall of her son's breathing. She had refused to sleep. When Andromeda had suggested she rest, Narcissa had simply looked at her with a flat, unyielding stare that brokered no argument. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. Andromeda's hand twitched toward her wand, a reflex honed by years of paranoia, before she consciously relaxed her fingers. The heavy, rhythmic tread belonged to only one person. Ted Tonks shuffled into the kitchen, his hair a spectacular mess of sandy curls, wearing a faded quilted dressing gown over his pajamas. He was rubbing his eyes, yawning widely, entirely unaware of the shift in the world until he crossed the threshold and his gaze landed on the table. He stopped. The yawn died in his throat. Ted was a man who possessed a quiet, unshakable solidity. He was a Muggle-born lawyer who dealt with the bureaucratic nightmares of the magical world, a man who absorbed chaos and transmuted it into order. But the sight of Narcissa Malfoy, the Ice Queen of the Sacred 28, sitting at his scarred oak table wearing his wife's spare cloak, caused a visible short-circuit behind his eyes. He looked at Narcissa. He looked at the unconscious boy on the table. He looked at Andromeda, noting the soot on her cheek, the blood crusted on her palm, and the wand resting within reach. Ted did not shout. He did not draw a wand. He walked slowly to the stove, picked up the iron kettle, and filled it at the sink. The sound of the running water was the only noise in the room. He set the kettle on the burner and lit it with a flick of his finger. "I married a black," Ted said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the silence. "I knew the family tree was more of a family wreath. But I didn't expect the Queen of Slytherin at my breakfast table." "Ted," Andromeda started, her voice raspy. "I silenced him last night," she said, gesturing to the living room. "I didn't want him to wake up and find." She trailed off, looking at Draco. Ted turned around, leaning his hips against the counter. He crossed his arms, the quilted gown falling open slightly. "Is that Draco Malfoy?" "Yes," Narcissa said. Her voice was steady, though her hands gripped the edges of the cloak tightly. "And I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Tonks. The circumstances were exigent." "Exigent," Ted repeated, tasting the word. He looked at Andromeda. "Is Dora like this?" "Yes." Andromeda stood up, her joints popping. She walked over to him, stopping just outside his reach. "It's the same affliction. We've stabilized him. We're going to stabilize her properly today, now that we know the shape of it." "But Ted, it's not an illness. It's a siphon." Ted's eyes darkened. The easygoing warmth he usually projected vanished, replaced by the sharp, analytical gaze of a man who spent his life finding the loopholes in predatory contracts. "Who?" "Dumbledore." The kettle began to whistle, a low, rising shriek. Ted reached out and silenced it with a tap of his wand, his eyes never leaving Andromeda's face. He processed the information. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask if she was letting her old family prejudices color her judgment. He knew his wife. He knew the precision of her mind. "All right," Ted said softly. He pushed off the counter and walked to the cupboards, pulling out 3 mugs. "Tea. Then you tell me everything. And then we figure out how to hide her from the headmaster of Hogwarts." He set a mug in front of Narcissa. It was chipped, bearing a faded cartoon of a badger wearing glasses. Narcissa stared at it as if it were an alien artifact. Slowly, her long fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic. "Thank you, Mr. Tonks," she murmured. "Ted," he corrected gently. "If we're harboring fugitives and declaring war on the most powerful wizard in Britain, we're on a first-name basis, Narcissa." A ghost of a smile, fragile and fleeting, touched Narcissa's lips. "Ted, then." For the next hour, the kitchen became a war room disguised as a breakfast nook. Andromeda laid out the etheric maps she had drawn during the night, the parchment covered in frantic, spidery arithmancy. Ted listened, asking incisive, practical questions that grounded their high magic theory in actionable reality. He didn't understand the deep blood magic, but he understood logistics, supply lines, and institutional blind spots. "You can't keep them both here indefinitely," Ted said, tracing the line of the bypass spell on the parchment. "The magical footprint of 2 unstable cores, even dampened, will eventually bleed through the Fidelius. The charm hides the location, not the ambient magical radiation. If Dumbledore is actively monitoring the tethers, he'll notice the resistance. He won't notice the resistance if the resistance mimics the natural fluctuation of a recovering core, Andromeda argued, tapping the diagram. I'm feeding the siphon ambient magic. To his sensors, it will just look like Draco and Dora are having a good day. Their output is stable. But you have to sleep, Andy, Ted said gently. You can't hold the bypass manually forever. You need to automate it, or you need to anchor it to something that doesn't tire. Narcissa set her mug down. The Malfoy ward stones. Both Andromeda and Ted looked at her. The manor sits on a convergence of 3 minor ley lines, Narcissa explained, her tone shifting into the clipped, authoritative cadence she used when managing the estate's accounts. Lucius uses them to power the perimeter shields, but the excess is vented into the earth. If I can reroute a fraction of that excess into a localized containment vessel, you could use it to power the bypass for Draco without drawing on your own core. Lucius would notice a drop in the ward pressure, Andromeda warned. Not if I adjust the calibration to account for seasonal atmospheric dampening, Narcissa said smoothly. I manage the household enchantments. Lucius thinks the wards maintain themselves. He hasn't looked at the runic schematics in a decade. She paused, her gray eyes hardening. I have to go back. If I am absent for too long, he will send the elves to search. If he finds out I am here, he will not see a mother saving her son. He will see a blood traitor corrupting the Malfoy heir. He will take Draco, and he will give him to the Dark Lord's healers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The reality of Narcissa's position, the gilded cage she had voluntarily entered, pressed down on them. You can't go back alone, Andromeda said. If he uses legilimency. My occlumency is flawless, Andy. You know this. Bellatrix taught me, but I perfected it because I had to survive her. Narcissa stood, the green cloak falling back to reveal her mud-stained silk robes. She looked down at them with a flicker of distaste, then raised her wand, casting a rapid series of cleaning and mending charms. The mud vanished. The silk smoothed. The tears sealed. In seconds, she looked immaculate, the armor of the Malfoy matriarch sliding back into place. I will secure the power source. But we need to know what we are fighting. The bypass is a bandage. We need to find the disease. The central anchor, Andromeda said. The etheric vision showed the lattice converging beneath Hogwarts. We need to see the physical mechanism. If we can map the frequency of the central siphon, I can build a permanent severance charm that won't cause a core collapse. Hogwarts is the most heavily warded location in Europe, Ted pointed out. Dumbledore knows every stone. Every shadow. You can't just walk in. We aren't going to walk in, Andromeda said, a strange, fierce light entering her eyes. We're going to fall in. The transition back to Malfoy Manor was a physical shock. Narcissa stepped out of the flue in her private solar, the emerald flames dying instantly behind her. The air here was different. It was climate-controlled to a precise, chill perfection, smelling of white lilies and polished marble. There was no warmth, no lived-in clutter. It was a mausoleum for the living. She stood still for a moment, letting her breathing slow, letting the frantic, terrified mother recede deep beneath the ice. She built her mental architecture. The frozen lake. Smooth, unbroken, reflecting only the sky. She checked her reflection in the gilded mirror. Perfect. Not a hair out of place. The mud of the Tonks cottage was a memory. Mistress, a small, trembling voice squeaked. Narcissa turned. Tilly, her personal house elf, was bowing so low her nose brushed the rug. Tilly was worrying. Mistress was gone all night. Master Lucius was asking. What did you tell him, Tilly? Narcissa asked, her voice a soft, dangerous purr. Tilly told Master that Mistress had a migraine and took a dreamless sleep draft in the guest wing and ordered not to be disturbed, the elf babbled, wringing her long fingers. Tilly locked the door, Mistress. Tilly put a silencing charm. Good girl, Narcissa said. She reached into her robes and produced a silver sickle, pressing it into the elf's hand. You have done well. Go to the kitchens and rest. I will not need you until noon. The elf popped away. Narcissa moved swiftly to her vanity, unlocking the hidden drawer beneath the jewelry box with a drop of her blood. She withdrew a small, lead-lined pouch. Inside was a raw, uncut piece of lodestone, humming with latent earth magic. This would be the vessel for the ley line diversion. She slipped it into her sleeve. She had to face Lucius before she could do anything else. The longer she avoided him, the more his suspicion would curdle into paranoia. She found him in the east drawing room, reading the Daily Prophet by the light of a floating candelabra. He looked up as she entered, his pale eyes sweeping over her, cataloguing her appearance, searching for flaws. Chissa, he said, his voice a smooth, cultured drawl. Your migraine abated quickly. It was severe, but brief, Narcissa replied, taking a seat opposite him. She crossed her legs, arranging her robes with practiced elegance. The draft was effective. Though I find the silence of the guest wing lacking the comfort of our own bed. Lucius folded the paper, setting it aside. Draco's letters have been sparse. How is he faring at the spa? You left rather abruptly yesterday. The alpine air is doing him good, Narcissa lied, the words flowing like water over glass. His color is better. The healer there, Madame Vane, believes the magical exhaustion was compounded by the altitude at Hogwarts. She has him on a strict regimen of restorative potions and limited spellcasting. Lucius steepled his fingers. I still say it is a weakness. A Malfoy should not succumb to mere altitude. When he returns, I will have him undergo the endurance trials. He must learn to push through fatigue. Narcissa's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird, but her face remained a mask of polite agreement. Perhaps, my love. But Madame Vane insists that pushing a depleted core leads to permanent fracturing. We must protect the asset before we can test its limits. The asset. That was what Draco was to him. An heir. A continuation of the name. Not a boy who liked to sketch dragons in the margins of his potions essays. Not a boy who was currently lying on a blood trader's table, his life force being siphoned by the man Lucius claimed to despise. See that he is back by the weekend, Lucius said, standing up. The Dark Lord has requested the presence of the families at the solstice gathering. Draco must be seen. Absence breeds rumors, and rumors are the currency of the weak. Of course, Narcissa said smoothly. He will be ready. Lucius paused at the door, looking back at her. For a fraction of a second, his gaze lingered on her hands, which were resting in her lap. You are not wearing your emeralds, Chissa. They felt too heavy for a morning with a lingering headache, she said. He nodded slowly, accepting the logic, and swept out of the room. Narcissa waited until his footsteps faded completely. Then, she let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she crossed the threshold. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, forcing the tremor to stop. She had bought them time. A week, perhaps, before Lucius demanded to see Draco. She stood and moved to the bookshelves. She needed to prepare for the infiltration. The Malfoy library was vast, second only to the restricted section at Hogwarts and the lost archives of the Blacks. She ran her fingers over the spines, searching for texts on foundational warding and architectural magic. She pulled down a heavy tome bound in grey dragon scale, the geometry of sanctuaries. As she flipped through the pages, a folded piece of parchment slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Narcissa bent to retrieve it. It was old, the parchment yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and entirely unfamiliar. It was not Lucius's script, nor his father's. The anchor points must be placed at the intersections of youthful volatility. The castle itself provides the macrostructure, but the microtethers require living conduits. It is not cruelty, Albus. It is the only way to stabilize the ley lines without drawing on the dark. We are building a dam, and the mortar must be flexible. The signature at the bottom was a single, sharp G. Narcissa stared at the letter. Gellert. Grindelwald. A chill raced down her spine. This wasn't just Dumbledore's project. This was a continuation. A blueprint drawn decades ago, resurrected and refined. Lucius must have purchased this at an underground auction, hoarding it as a piece of dark history without understanding its active application. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her lead-lined pouch beside the lodestone. This was the proof they needed. This was the thread that would unravel the paragon of the light. They met at the edge of the forbidden forest 3 nights later. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the world in shades of charcoal and ink. Andromeda materialized from the shadows, her apparition silent, leaving no crack of displaced air. She wore dark, practical robes, her hair bound tightly back. Her healer's satchel was slung across her chest, alongside a bandolier of glass vials containing volatile alchemical compounds. Narcissa stepped out from behind the trunk of an ancient oak. She was dressed in midnight blue, a color that absorbed the faint starlight. She did not look like a society wife tonight. She looked like a blade. "You're late," Andromeda whispered. "I had to wait for the house elves to enter their dormancy cycle," Narcissa replied, her voice barely carrying over the rustle of the leaves. "Lucius is at a ministry function. We have a 4-hour window before he returns and expects me to be in my chambers." "Did you bring the stone?" Narcissa held up the lead pouch. "Charged and calibrated. It will hold the bypass for Draco for exactly 6 hours. After that, the lodestone will crack, and the siphon will revert to his core. Then we have 6 hours to map the machine and get out," Andromeda said. She looked toward the distant, looming silhouette of Hogwarts Castle. The windows glowed with warm, inviting light, a beacon of safety for the magical world. Tonight, it looked like a fortress. "Are you ready? How do we bypass the perimeter?" Narcissa asked. "The anti-apparition jinx extends to the forest edge. The disillusionment charms will be stripped by the outer wardstones." "We don't use standard charms," Andromeda said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out 2 small, silver rings, etched with runes so old they made the eyes ache to look at them. "Put this on your right index finger." Narcissa took the ring, sliding it over her knuckle. It was cold, biting into her skin. "What is this?" "Umbral weaving," Andromeda said. "It's not an invisibility cloak. It doesn't bend light. It convinces the space around you that you are an absence. You become a shadow. But you have to move like one. No sudden bursts of speed. No emotional spikes. If your heart rate jumps, the shadow frays." "And the wardstones?" "The House of Black helped lay the deep foundations of Hogwarts," Andromeda said, a note of grim pride in her voice. "Before the ministry regulated blood magic, the founders made covenants with the noble houses. Our blood is recognized by the bedrock. The upper wards will try to stop us, but the deep earth will let us pass, because it remembers who we are." Narcissa looked at her sister. "You've been planning this." "I've been preparing for the day the light failed us," Andromeda corrected. "Let's go." They moved into the forest. The umbral weaving was a disorienting, visceral experience. Narcissa felt the magic wrap around her like cold water, seeping into her pores, dampening her physical presence. When she looked at Andromeda, she didn't see a person, she saw a vaguely humanoid distortion in the darkness, a smudge of deeper black against the trees. They did not speak. They communicated through the subtle shifts in their magical auras, a silent language they had relearned over the past 3 days of intensive preparation. Left. Wait. Step over the root. Pause. They reached the perimeter ward line. It was invisible to the eye, but to their magical senses, it was a roaring wall of golden fire. Narcissa hesitated. The power radiating from it was immense, designed to repel anything with ill intent. Andromeda reached out and took Narcissa's hand. Blood to blood, she projected. Let the earth know us. They stepped through the ward line together. Narcissa braced for the burning, for the alarm bells, for the crushing weight of Dumbledore's magic. Instead, she felt a deep, resonant hum vibrate through the soles of her boots. The bedrock recognized the black bloodline. The golden fire parted around them, not like a door opening, but like water flowing around a stone. They were not breaking the ward, they were being accepted by the foundation beneath it. They skirted the edge of the black lake, avoiding the patrols of the groundskeeper. The castle loomed above them, massive and silent. They did not head for the doors. They headed for the cliff face beneath the viaduct, where the ancient stone met the raw earth. Andromeda found the spot. A section of rock that looked identical to the rest, but hummed with a dormant, iron-heavy frequency. She pressed her bleeding palm, the same hand she had cut for the ritual, against the stone. Open, she whispered in the old tongue. By the right of the first covenant. The stone did not grind or slide. It simply ceased to be solid, turning into a mist of gray dust that they walked through, reforming instantly behind them. They were in the deep sublevels. This was not the dungeons where Snape brewed his potions. This was beneath the dungeons, in the cavernous spaces where the castle's magic pooled and settled. The air was cold, smelling of ozone, crushed rock, and something sweet and cloying, like rotting lilies. They dropped the umbral weaving, the shadows peeling away from them. Narcissa gasped softly, rubbing her arms. The magic had left her feeling hollowed out. Keep your voice down, Andromeda murmured, lighting the tip of her wand with a dim, blue foxfire. The acoustics down here carry for miles. They navigated the winding, natural tunnels, following the pull of the siphon. Andromeda had attuned her healer's sight to the specific frequency of the void inside Dora, and she followed it like a bloodhound on a scent. The deeper they went, the stronger the pull became. It was no longer a thin thread, it was a rushing river of stolen power, flowing downward. They emerged into a vast, circular cavern. Narcissa stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. The cavern was dominated by a machine. But to call it a machine was to fundamentally misunderstand its nature. It was an orrery of light and crystal, suspended in the center of the chamber without any visible means of support. Massive rings of spun glass rotated slowly around a central core of blinding, pure white light. Thousands of silver threads, thin as spider silk, extended from the rings, disappearing into the stone ceiling, reaching up toward the castle above. It was beautiful. It was the most terrifying thing Narcissa had ever seen. Merlin, Andromeda breathed, stepping closer. Her healer's sight was overwhelmed. The machine was singing, a harmonious, multitonal chord that vibrated in her teeth. It was the sound of order imposed on chaos. She walked to the edge of the central platform. Beneath the rotating rings, etched into the stone floor, was an arithmetic circle of staggering complexity. It was the control matrix. Andromeda knelt, her eyes darting across the runes, translating the flow of power. "This is it," she whispered. "The greater balance. Look at the intake valves. It's not just siphoning power, it's filtering it. It takes the volatile, chaotic magic from the children, strips the emotional resonance, and feeds the pure, stabilized energy into the castle's foundational wards. It's reinforcing the anti-dark magic barriers around Hogwarts. He's using them as batteries to keep the school safe. He's sacrificing them for the many," Narcissa said, stepping up beside her. She looked at the thousands of silver threads. "How many, Andy? How many threads are there?" Andromeda squinted, her mind doing the rapid calculations. "Hundreds. Maybe thousands over the years. Not all of them are active at once. The siphon only engages when a child's magic reaches a certain threshold of volatility. Dora's metamorphmagus ability. Draco's pureblood core density. Neville Longbottom's late blooming. Luna Lovegood's sight. She looked up, her face pale with horror. He's been doing this for decades. Anyone who showed exceptional promise or dangerous instability. He stabilized them, and he took the excess. Narcissa reached into her pouch and pulled out the folded parchment she had found in the library. She handed it to Andromeda. "Read this." Andromeda unfolded the brittle paper, her eyes scanning Grindelwald's elegant script. Her jaw tightened. The mortar must be flexible. He didn't abandon the plan, Chissa. He and Grindelwald designed this together. When they fought, when Dumbledore won, he didn't destroy the machine. He kept it. He convinced himself it was necessary. He made it humane, Narcissa said, her voice dripping with venom. He gave them a golden light instead of a dark brand. He told them he was helping. That is the true horror of it, Andy. He doesn't think he's a monster. He thinks he's a martyr. We need to map the frequency, Andromeda said, shaking off the philosophical horror and focusing on the task. She pulled a blank roll of parchment and a self-inking quill from her satchel. Hold the light. I need to copy the central harmonic sequence. If I can replicate the frequency of the master siphon, I can create an inversion wave. We can shatter the tethers simultaneously without causing a feedback loop into the children's cores. She set to work, her quill flying across the parchment, translating the three-dimensional light structures into two-dimensional arithmancy. Narcissa stood guard, her wand drawn, her senses extended to the limits. The machine was loud to her magical senses, a roaring waterfall of power, but beneath it, she listened for the footfalls of the living. 20 minutes passed. Andromeda was sweating, the intricate work demanding absolute precision. One wrong rune, and the inversion wave would kill every child connected to the lattice. I have the primary sequence, Andromeda muttered. I just need the anchor points for the physical release. Andy, Narcissa hissed. Andromeda froze. Someone is coming, Narcissa whispered. The tunnel we came through. Footsteps. One person. Moving fast. Andromeda rolled up the parchment, shoving it into her satchel. Can we reweave the shadows? Not in time. The ambient light from the machine is too strong, it will burn through the umbral magic before it sets. Narcissa's mind raced. Hide. Get behind the control matrix. Do not make a sound. And you? I am Draco's mother, concerned about his sudden decline, coming to demand answers from the headmaster, Narcissa said, her posture shifting instantly. The stealth operative vanished, the furious, aristocratic parent appeared. Go. Andromeda slipped behind the massive stone dais of the control matrix, pressing herself flat against the cold rock, pulling her magical signature in so tight it was barely a whisper. The footsteps echoed into the cavern. Narcissa turned to face the tunnel entrance, her wand held loosely at her side, her face arranged in a mask of imperious annoyance. Severus Snape stepped into the light of the machine. He stopped. His black eyes swept the cavern, taking in the massive orrery, the glowing threads, and finally, Narcissa Malfoy standing alone on the platform. He did not look surprised to see the machine. He looked entirely, dangerously focused on her. Narcissa, Snape said, his voice a soft, silken drawl that carried effortlessly over the hum of the lattice. This is a restricted area. Even for the Board of Governors. I am not here as a governor, Severus, Narcissa said coldly. I am here as a mother. Albus told me Draco's magical fluctuations were being monitored. He did not tell me my son was connected to this abomination. Snape's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his gaze probing, searching for the lie. Narcissa held her ground, letting her occlumency shields form the frozen lake. She projected her genuine fear for Draco, her genuine anger at Dumbledore's secrecy. She buried the memory of the cottage, of Andromeda, of the blood ritual beneath layers of ice. The headmaster's methods are his own, Snape said slowly. But they are necessary. The lattice prevents catastrophic magical failures within the student body. Draco is safe. Safe. Narcissa let a tremor of real emotion enter her voice. He is fading, Severus. His core is being eaten. If this is safety, I would prefer the danger. Snape stopped a few feet from her. He looked at the machine, then back to her. You should not be here, Narcissa. If the headmaster finds you. Let him find me, she snapped. Let him explain why he treats the children of his allies like fuel for his wards. Snape was silent for a long moment. He was a master legilimens, but he was also a man who understood the fierce, terrifying love of a protector. He saw no deception in her surface emotions, only the righteous fury of a mother. But Snape was not a man who accepted things at face value. He inhaled slowly, his nostrils flaring. You smell of ozone, Snape said quietly. And didn't he? And, you. Narcissa's heart stopped. You. Andromeda's wand. I was in the greenhouses earlier, Narcissa said smoothly, not missing a beat. Sprout was showing me the new cultivation of magical flora. The ozone is from this machine. As for the U, I carry a cutting in my pouch for potion making. You know my habits, Severus. It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. Snape's eyes locked onto hers, the black pools deepening as he pushed, just a fraction, against her mental shields. Narcissa pushed back. Not with a wall, but with a mirror. She reflected his own suspicion back at him, layered with her maternal grief. Look at me, Severus. Look at what they are doing to our children. Snape broke the gaze first. He looked away, his jaw tightening. He knew she was hiding something. He knew the you sent was wrong. But he also knew that pushing a Malfoy matriarch in her current state would yield nothing but a political nightmare, and more importantly, he sensed the raw, protective magic radiating from her. It didn't feel like dark magic. It felt like desperation. Leave, Narcissa, Snape said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I will tell the headmaster you were lost and I escorted you out. Do not come down here again. The lattice is temperamental. And the headmaster does not forgive those who tamper with his architecture. I am not tampering, Severus, Narcissa said, her voice softening just enough to sound vulnerable. I am looking for a way to save my son. If you know of one, I beg of you, tell me. Snape looked at her, a complex web of emotions flickering across his usually impassive face. Pity. Resignation. Shared burden. There is no saving them from the lattice without breaking the castle, Snape said softly. That is the equation Dumbledore has accepted. Go home to your husband, Narcissa. Make Draco comfortable. The same words the French healer had used. The words that had driven her to Andromeda. Narcissa gave a stiff, formal nod. Good night, Severus. She turned and walked past him, her head held high, her steps echoing on the stone. She did not look back. She did not look at the control matrix where her sister was hiding. She walked into the tunnel, her occlumency shields holding firm until she was completely out of his sight. Behind the dais, Andromeda let out a breath that was half sob. She waited until Snape's footsteps retreated in the opposite direction, toward the upper levels, before she dared to move. She found Narcissa waiting at the bedrock exit, her face pale, her hands trembling violently now that the audience was gone. He knew, Narcissa whispered as Andromeda grabbed her arm. He knew I was lying about the you. He let me go. Because he's conflicted, Andromeda said, pressing her palm to the stone to open the passage. He hates the machine, Chissa. Did you see his face? He hates it, but he thinks it's necessary. He's trapped in the same geometry Dumbledore is. They stepped through the stone, back into the damp air of the forest. The umbral weaving was too risky now, Snape might be monitoring the shadow frequencies. They moved fast, relying on standard disillusionment and the natural cover of the dark, racing toward the ward line. When they finally crossed the boundary and operated back to the Tonks cottage, the physical toll of the night crashed down on them. They collapsed in the kitchen, the lead pouch and the copied parchment placed on the table between them like spoils of war. Ted was awake, sitting in the dark, a cold cup of tea in front of him. He looked at their haggard faces, the dirt on their robes, the shaking of their hands. He didn't ask what happened. He stood up, walked to the stove, and put the kettle on. "Did you get it?" Ted asked quietly. Andromeda pulled the parchment from her satchel, unrolling it on the table. The arithmancy glowed faintly in the dim light. "I have the sequence. I can build the inversion wave." "But Ted." She looked up, her eyes haunted. "There are hundreds of them. If we shatter the lattice, the feedback won't just hit Dora and Draco. It will hit every child connected to it. The sudden return of their siphoned magic could cause core ruptures. We can't just break the machine." "Then what do we do?" Narcissa asked, accepting the fresh mug of tea Ted handed her. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady. "We don't break it," Andromeda said, staring at the glowing runes. "We take control of it. We rewrite the equation. We turn the siphon into a font. We give the magic back, slowly, safely, on our terms." She looked at her sister. "The Ice Queen and the Blood Traitor. The Mother and the Healer." "Dumbledore thinks he's the only one who can do the math," Andromeda said, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Let's show him what happens when the House of Black balances the ledger." Chapter 3, Sisters Black. The chalk snapped. Andromeda stared at the broken white cylinder in her hand, then at the jagged line it had left across the slate floor of the cottage cellar. She didn't curse. She simply set the broken piece down, picked up a fresh one, and began to redraw the arithmetic sequence for the 14th time. Her knuckles were scraped raw, dusted with a fine layer of white powder that looked like ash. They had been at it for 72 hours. Sleep was a concept they had abandoned somewhere around the second day, replacing it with pepper-up potions that tasted like battery acid and left their hearts beating a frantic, syncopated rhythm against their ribs. The cellar, usually reserved for Ted's collection of enchanted Muggle law books and Andromeda's overflow of dried herbs, had been transformed into a workshop of impossible geometry. Narcissa sat on a stool a few feet away, her wand moving in microscopic, precise flicks. She was not drawing, she was carving. Using a localized severing charm, she was etching the anchor points into a slab of obsidian they had salvaged from the Malfoy gardens. Her face was drawn, the elegant lines of her cheekbones sharpened to blades by exhaustion, but her hand did not tremble. "You're forcing the tertiary loop," Narcissa said, her voice a dry rasp. She didn't look up from the obsidian. "The flow from the lodestone can't handle that much torque. If you push the inversion wave through that angle, it will bottleneck at the 7th rune and shatter the containment. It won't bottleneck if I lubricate the channel with a localized stasis field," Andromeda countered, not stopping her drawing. "The siphon is rigid, Chissa. It's built on light magic principles. Order. Symmetry. If we hit it with something fluid, something that refuses to hold a shape, it won't know how to resist." "You are treating a foundational ward like a clogged artery," Narcissa said, finally pausing to blow the stone dust from her carving. "It is architecture, Andy. You cannot heal a building. You must dismantle it brick by brick, or bring the roof down on our own heads." "I am a healer," Andromeda said, sitting back on her heels and wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a white streak across her skin. "I fix what is broken. And right now, the flow of magic is broken. I'm not dismantling the roof, I'm reversing the plumbing." Narcissa set her wand down and rubbed her eyes. "If the plumbing bursts, Draco's core ruptures. I will not risk him on a metaphor." "It's not a metaphor, it's a biological reality applied to etheric theory," Andromeda snapped, the fatigue finally fraying her temper. "You want to treat it like a Malfoy vault. Lock it down, control the variables. But magic isn't gold, Narcissa. It breathes. It reacts. If we try to force it into a rigid new structure, it will fight us. We have to coax it back. Silence stretched between them, thick and brittle. The only sound was the hum of the lodestone sitting in its lead cradle on the workbench, glowing with a faint, angry violet light. It was holding the bypass for both children now, but the stone was webbed with hairline fractures. It was failing. Narcissa stood up. She walked over to where Andromeda sat on the floor. For a moment, Andromeda braced for an argument, for the cold, aristocratic withdrawal that had defined their relationship for 20 years. Instead, Narcissa knelt beside her. She reached out and gently took the chalk from Andromeda's cramped fingers. "Your hand is cramping," Narcissa said softly. She began to massage the tight muscles at the base of Andromeda's thumb, her touch surprisingly strong, surprisingly knowing. "You always gripped your wand too tightly when you were tired. Mother used to scold you for it. Said you held it like a dagger instead of a conduit." Andromeda let out a long, shaky breath, leaning into the touch. "Mother scolded me for breathing too loudly. I didn't realize you remembered." "I remember everything," Narcissa said. Her eyes were fixed on Andromeda's hand. "I remember you sneaking into my room when the thunderstorms hit the manor, because your room faced the lake and the wind howled. I remember you teaching me how to braid my hair so it wouldn't tangle in the potion fumes. I remember the day you left." She paused, her thumb pressing into a knot of tension. "I remember standing at the window, watching you walk down the drive, and feeling like someone had carved out my lungs." Andromeda turned her head, looking at her sister's profile. "Why didn't you come after me?" "Because I was a coward," Narcissa said simply. There was no self-pity in the statement, only a stark, brutal honesty. "Because Bellatrix was watching. Because Lucius was offering a shield, and I was so terrified of the dark that I let him build a cage and call it a castle. I thought if I was perfect, if I was exactly what they wanted, I wouldn't feel the missing pieces." She looked up, meeting Andromeda's eyes. "But you were right. Magic breathes. And I have been holding my breath for 2 decades. She released Andromeda's hand and picked up the chalk. With 3 swift, fluid motions, she altered the tertiary loop on the slate, softening the harsh angles Andromeda had drawn, blending the rigid arithmancy with a sweeping, organic curve. "There," Narcissa said. "Not a vault. Not an artery. A riverbed. Let it flow, but give it banks to guide it." Andromeda stared at the alteration. It was brilliant. It took her rigid healing intent and gave it the structural integrity of Narcissa's architectural mind. It was the synthesis they had been failing to achieve for 3 days. "A riverbed," Andromeda murmured. She picked up her wand, tracing the new line. The magic flared, a warm, steady gold instead of the angry, sparking yellow it had been producing all night. It held. "Merlin, Chissa. That's it. That's the sequence." Before Narcissa could respond, a sound echoed from the floor above. It was a scream. Not a shout of surprise, but a raw, tearing sound of absolute agony. Both women were on their feet instantly, wands drawn, the exhaustion vanishing beneath a spike of pure adrenaline. They took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into the hallway. Ted was already in the back room, kneeling beside Dora's bed. Dora was arching off the mattress, her back bowed in an impossible curve. The gray pallor of her skin was gone, replaced by a violent, shifting kaleidoscope of colors that burned too bright, flashing from blinding white to bruised purple in fractions of a second. Her magic was boiling. On the cot beside her, where they had moved Draco for proximity to the lodestone, the boy was seizing in perfect, horrifying synchronization. "The stone!" Narcissa gasped, rushing to the workbench in the corner. The lead cradle was smoking. The lodestone inside was glowing white-hot, the hairline fractures expanding into deep fissures. As they watched, a chunk of the stone crumbled into gray dust. He's pulling, Andromeda said, dropping to her knees beside Dora, her hands hovering over her daughter's chest, feeling the terrifying, chaotic heat. Dumbledore. He senses the resistance. He thinks the siphon is failing, so he's increasing the draw to compensate. He's trying to force the magic through the blockage. He's going to burn them out, Narcissa said, her voice rising in panic as she tried to cast a cooling charm on the fracturing stone. The spell hissed and evaporated. Andy, the bypass is collapsing. We don't have days. We don't have hours. Andromeda looked at Dora's face. Her daughter's eyes were open, but they were entirely white, rolled back in her head. Blood was beginning to weep from her tear ducts, bright and stark against her shifting skin. Ted, Andromeda said, her voice dropping into a register of terrifying calm. Get the go bags. The ones we packed for the safe house. Ted didn't ask questions. He turned and sprinted for the closet. Chissa, Andromeda said, looking up at her sister. How long until the solstice dinner begins? Narcissa checked the grandfather clock in the hall with a quick, desperate glance. An hour. The guests will be arriving. Lucius will be looking for me. Then we go now, Andromeda said. She stood up, her healer's satchel already over her shoulder. She grabbed the slate with the completed arithmancy, shrinking it and slipping it into her robes. She picked up the smoking remains of the lodestone, wrapping it in a fireproof cloth. We don't sneak in. We don't hide. We walk through the front doors. Andy, the wards. The wards recognize black blood. We prove that, Andromeda said. But this time, we aren't asking the earth to let us pass. We're going to make the castle answer to us. She looked at Ted, who returned with 2 heavy canvas bags. Ted, you stay here. Maintain the physical stasis on their bodies. If their hearts stop, you use the Muggle defibrillator, not magic. Magic will only feed the feedback loop. Keep them breathing until we break the machine. Ted grabbed her shoulders, his grip bruising. You come back. Both of you. You hear me? You break his machine, and you come back to me. I promise, Andromeda said. She kissed him, hard and fast, then turned to Narcissa. Are you ready to ruin your reputation, sister? Narcissa drew herself up to her full height. The fear was still there, but it was encased in something harder, something forged in the fires of the last 3 days. She raised her wand, casting a rapid transfiguration on her robes. The midnight blue shifted, the fabric darkening, tightening, weaving itself into a high-collared gown of absolute, light-devouring onyx. Silver thread, not Malfoy silver, but the pale, starlight silver of the House of Black, traced the cuffs and hem. She pulled her hair back, securing it with a pin shaped like a raven in flight. My reputation, Narcissa said coldly, is the least of his concerns. The Great Hall of Hogwarts was a masterpiece of seasonal enchantment. The ceiling mirrored a crisp, star-dusted winter sky, the constellations slowly rotating in time with the real heavens above. Long tables were laden with silver platters, crystal goblets, and floating candelabras that cast a warm, honeyed glow over the gathered elite of the magical world. It was a neutral ground, a tradition Dumbledore had maintained for years. The solstice dinner brought together the Board of Governors, senior ministry officials, and key members of the Order of the Phoenix. It was a display of unity, a reminder that despite the looming shadow of the Dark Lord, the institutions of the light stood firm. Lucius Malfoy stood near the head table, a glass of elf-made wine in his hand, holding court with a cluster of ministry sycophants. He was immaculate, his silver blonde hair catching the candlelight, his posture radiating board superiority. But his eyes were restless, darting toward the heavy oak doors every time they opened. Narcissa was late. This was unacceptable. At the head table, Albus Dumbledore sat in his high-backed chair, wearing robes of deep plum embroidered with golden suns. He was smiling, nodding at a joke made by Minister Fudge, but his blue eyes were distant, calculating. He had felt the tremor in the lattice 3 hours ago. A subtle resistance, like a gear catching on a piece of grit. He had adjusted the flow, increasing the draw to smooth out the anomaly. It was a necessary adjustment. The wards required stability. The heavy oak doors of the great hall did not open. They dissolved. The sound was not a crash, but a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in the chest of every person in the room. The ancient would simply turn to mist, revealing the entrance hall beyond. The conversation died instantly. The clinking of silverware ceased. Hundreds of heads turned. Through the mist walked 2 women. They did not look like guests. They looked like an execution. Andromeda Tonks wore her healer's robes, but they were stripped of the standard St. Mungo's teal. They were stark white, heavily warded, the fabric rippling with kinetic energy. Her wand was already in her hand, not raised in a threat, but held loosely at her side, an extension of her arm. Beside her, Narcissa Malfoy was a vision in onyx and starlight. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at the minister. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the head table. Lucius stepped forward, his face a mask of shock quickly hardening into fury. Narcissa. What is the meaning of this? Where have you been? Narcissa did not break stride. She walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. Do not speak to me, Lucius. Not tonight. The sheer, casual dismissal froze him in place. The room was utterly silent, the tension so thick it felt like breathing water. Dumbledore stood up slowly. He did not draw his wand. He placed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward. Andromeda. Narcissa. This is an unexpected pleasure. Though perhaps a breach of protocol. Protocol is a luxury for those who aren't bleeding, Albus, Andromeda said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the hall, amplified by a subtle sonorous charm. We are not here for the dinner. Then what brings you to my school? Dumbledore asked, his tone gentle, probing. He was scanning them, his legitimacy brushing against their shields like a gentle breeze testing a windowpane. He found nothing but smooth, impenetrable glass. We are here for the machine, Narcissa said. A murmur rippled through the hall. Confusion. Machine? What machine? Dumbledore's smile did not falter, but the temperature in his eyes dropped to absolute zero. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Narcissa. Perhaps the stress of Draco's illness has clouded your judgment. I have a private parlor where we can discuss this. Do not patronize me, Narcissa snapped, stopping at the base of the dais leading to the head table. Do not use that grandfatherly tone on me. I have seen the lattice. I have seen the threads. I have seen the letter from Grindelwald in my husband's library. The mention of Grindelwald made Dumbledore flinch. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the jaw, but to the sisters, it was a confession. Severus Snape, standing in the shadows near the staff table, went perfectly still. His black eyes locked onto Narcissa, then shifted to Andromeda. He saw the white robes, the wand, the absolute, terrifying certainty in their posture. They aren't here to expose him to the crowd, Snape realized. They're here to draw him out. There is nothing beneath this castle but stone and history, Dumbledore said, his voice hardening, losing its warmth. You are trespassing, Andromeda. And you are hysterical, Narcissa. I must insist you leave. We aren't leaving, Andromeda said. She raised her wand. Instantly, a dozen Order members were on their feet, wands drawn. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Moody, McGonagall. The air filled with the sharp crackle of defensive spells being primed. Stand down. Dumbledore commanded, his voice suddenly booming with the power that had made him a legend. The Order members hesitated, but did not lower their wands. You want to protect them? Andromeda asked, looking at the wands pointed at her. You want to protect the man who is eating your children? Ask Minerva why her most volatile student suddenly becomes so, manageable after a private meeting with the headmaster. Ask Kingsley why the Auror office's magical exhaustion rates dropped by 40% the year Dumbledore implemented his wellness checks. McGonagall's wand wavered. She looked at Dumbledore, her lips parted. Albus? What is she talking about? Minerva, please, Dumbledore said, a note of genuine weariness entering his voice. They are confused. Grief makes us see monsters where there are only shadows. I am not seeing shadows, Narcissa said. She reached into her robes and pulled out the brittle, yellowed parchment. She didn't hand it to Dumbledore, she flicked her wand, sending it floating up to hover in the center of the hall, magnified by a projection charm so every person could read Grindelwald's elegant, damning script. The mortar must be flexible. We are building a dam, and the mortar must be flexible. He is siphoning the children, Andromeda said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. He is using their cores to power the foundational wards of this castle. He is stealing their magic to maintain his greater balance. And we are going down there to turn it off. Pandemonium erupted. Shouts of denial, of outrage, of confusion. Lucius was staring at the floating letter, his face draining of color as he recognized his own stolen property. Fudge was sputtering, demanding to know what was going on. Silence. Dumbledore roared. The magic in his voice slammed into the room like a physical wave, forcing everyone into stillness. He looked at the sisters, and for the first time, the mask was gone. He looked ancient. He looked like a man holding up the sky. You do not understand what you are threatening, Dumbledore said, his voice low, meant only for them, though the silence carried it. If you disrupt the lattice, the ambient magic of Britain will flood the ley lines. The castle will tear itself apart. The wards keeping the dark creatures in the forest at bay will fail. You will kill hundreds to save a few. You don't get to make that choice. Andromeda shouted back, stepping onto the first stair of the dais. You don't get to decide whose magic is fuel and whose is sacred. You are a parasite, Albus. A parasite with a savior complex. I bear the sin so they can live in the light, Dumbledore said softly. It is my burden. Not yours. It's our children, Narcissa said. And we are taking them back. She didn't wait for his response. She turned and sprinted not toward the head table, but toward the hidden servant stairwell behind the staff dais, the most direct route to the deep levels. Andromeda was right beside her. Stop them. Dumbledore ordered, but he didn't cast a spell. He moved to follow, his long strides eating the distance. Snape stepped into his path. Severus, move, Dumbledore said, his eyes flashing. Headmaster, Snape said smoothly, his voice a silken barrier. The guests are panicking. Minister Fudge is attempting to flee. Someone must manage the hall. I will pursue them. No, I must go, Dumbledore said, trying to step around him. Snape didn't draw his wand, but he shifted his weight, subtly altering the magical pressure in the space between them, creating a momentary, localized density that forced Dumbledore to pause. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Albus, McGonagall said, her voice trembling but firm, stepping up beside Snape. Look at the hall. Look at the letter. You need to answer to these people. Now. Dumbledore looked at the floating parchment, at the terrified, angry faces of his allies, at the cold fury in Lucius Malfoy's eyes. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that the narrative had already slipped from his grasp. He could not leave. Severus, Dumbledore said, his voice tight. Do not let them touch the core. Stun them if you must. Bind them. But do not let them break the machine. Snape gave a curt nod, turned, and swept into the stairwell after the sisters. The descent was a blur of motion and shadow. Andromeda and Narcissa did not run, they flowed, their footsteps synchronized, their magic reaching ahead to unlock doors and silence alarms before they even triggered. The air grew colder, the smell of ozone and rotting lilies growing stronger. They burst into the cavern. The machine was agitated. The rings of spun glass were spinning faster, the pure white light at the center pulsing with an angry, erratic rhythm. The silver threads were taut, vibrating like plucked harp strings. It knew they were here. It could feel the intent in their blood. Set the anchors. Andromeda yelled over the roar of the machine. She pulled the shrunk slate from her robes, enlarging it with a flick of her wand and slamming it onto the stone floor at the edge of the control matrix. Narcissa moved to the opposite side, drawing the obsidian slab from her bag and placing it precisely on the counternode. She began to chant, her voice cutting through the mechanical noise, laying down the structural containment field. The tunnel behind them echoed with footsteps. Snape emerged, his wand drawn, his face unreadable. "Step away from the matrix," Snape commanded, his voice echoing in the cavern. "Severus, don't," Narcissa said, not looking up from her casting. Her hands were glowing with silver light as she wove the riverbed. "You know what this is. You saw it. You told me to make him comfortable. I am choosing a different path." "The headmaster's orders are absolute," Snape said, raising his wand. "If you shatter the core, the feedback will destroy the castle." "We aren't shattering it," Andromeda shouted, kneeling by the slate, her wand tracing the organic curves Narcissa had designed. "We're rewriting it. We're turning the siphon into a font. We're giving it back." Snape hesitated. His wand did not lower, but the tip dipped a fraction of an inch. He looked at the machine, feeling the violent, hungry pull of it. He had hated this room for years. He had stood in this cavern and watched Dumbledore rationalize the theft of his students' souls, telling himself that the ends justified the means, telling himself that he was a spy, that he had to play the game. He looked at Narcissa. She was sweating, her onyx robes clinging to her, her magic pouring into the obsidian slab with a fierce, protective devotion he had rarely seen. She wasn't doing this for power. She was doing it for love. "Severus," Andromeda said, her voice strained as she connected the first tertiary loop. "If you're going to stop us, do it now. Because in 30 seconds, I'm opening the valve, and I won't be able to stop." Snape looked at the slate. He recognized the arithmancy. It was brilliant. It was reckless. It was entirely black. He lowered his wand. "The ambient magic in this room will fight the inversion," Snape said quietly. "The machine is drawing on the castle's reserves to defend itself. You will not have enough power to push the wave through the central core." Andromeda looked up, shocked. "What are you saying?" Snape stepped forward, moving past the ward line Narcissa had established. He stood between the sisters and the tunnel entrance, turning his back to them, facing the way they had come. He raised his wand, not at the machine, but at the cavern walls. "I am saying," Snape murmured, "that I am casting a localized vacuum ward. I will sever this room from the castle's ambient feed for exactly 60 seconds. The machine will starve. It will be vulnerable. Do not waste the time." He began to chant in a low, rapid cadence. The air in the cavern instantly grew heavy, the roaring hum of the machine dropping an octave as its connection to the upper levels was brutally severed. The white light at the center flickered, dimming. "Now, Andy!" Narcissa screamed. Andromeda slammed her palm onto the center of the slate. "By the blood of the first, by the right of the broken, I unmake the chain." She pushed her magic into the sequence. It didn't feel like casting a spell, it felt like grabbing a live wire. The magic of the machine fought back, a searing, righteous heat that tried to burn her out. It screamed at her, showing her visions of the castle crumbling, of darkness flooding the halls, of Dumbledore's sorrowful, disappointed face. "You are breaking the world," the machine whispered. "I am fixing my daughter," Andromeda thought back, and pushed harder. The inversion wave hit the central core. For a moment, nothing happened. The white light pulsed, resisting the foreign magic. Then, the organic curve Narcissa had carved caught the rigid energy. It didn't break the light, it bent it. It forced the flow to stutter, to hesitate, and then, slowly, agonizingly, to reverse. The silver threads attached to the ceiling turned gold. The sound changed. The mechanical roar became a chorus of sighs. The magic was rushing upward, flowing back through the tethers, returning to the children it had been stolen from. Narcissa held the containment field, her arms shaking, her teeth gritted as the feedback washed over her shields. She felt Draco's magic pass through the lattice. It felt like a cold, frightened bird suddenly finding the sky. She felt it expand, warm and whole, rushing back to his body. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast, but she did not break her focus. The machine began to dismantle itself. Not exploding, but blooming. The rings of spun glass slowed, then dissolved into fine, glittering dust that rained down on the stone floor. The central core of white light expanded, washing over the sisters in a wave of pure, unfiltered magic, and then faded into nothingness. The cavern was suddenly, shockingly quiet. The only light came from the glowing runes on Andromeda's slate and the faint lumos on Snape's wand. The great, terrible architecture of the greater balance was gone. In its place was just an empty room, smelling of dust and ozone. Andromeda collapsed onto her hands and knees, gasping for air. Her magical core felt scraped hollow, aching with a deep, bone-level exhaustion. But beneath the exhaustion, she felt a profound, resonant peace. The void was gone. The cold, mechanical pull was gone. Narcissa lowered her hands. The obsidian slab cracked down the middle, its purpose fulfilled, and crumbled to ash. She fell back onto the stone, her chest heaving, her onyx robes covered in white dust. Snape lowered his wand. The vacuum ward dissolved. The ambient magic of the castle slowly seeped back into the room, but it felt different now. Lighter. Wilder. Unchained. He turned to look at the sisters. It is done. Andromeda pushed herself up, wiping her face. Is it stable? The castle? Snape closed his eyes, extending his senses. The wards are fluctuating. They are weaker, drawing on the earth instead of, the alternative. But they are holding. The castle will survive. The headmaster, however, will have a much more difficult time explaining the sudden drop in his power base to the board. Narcissa stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her robes. She looked at Snape. Thank you, Severus. Snape gave a stiff, almost imperceptible bow. Do not thank me, Narcissa. I merely found the headmaster's arithmetic distasteful. Go. Before he realizes the vacuum has lifted and comes down here himself. Take the servant stairs to the Hogsmeade boundary. I will tell him you escaped. Andromeda grabbed her satchel. She looked at the empty space where the machine had been. He'll try to rebuild it. Let him try, Narcissa said, her voice hard. The secret is out. The letter is floating in the Great Hall. The Order knows. The Ministry knows. He cannot harvest in the light. They left the cavern, moving fast, their bodies aching but their spirits soaring. They didn't speak as they navigated the tunnels, didn't speak as they slipped out into the freezing night air near the edge of the forbidden forest, didn't speak as they apparat back to the Tonks cottage. They materialized in the hallway. Ted was sitting on the floor between the two beds, his head in his hands. He looked up as they appeared, his eyes red-rimmed. Andromeda dropped her satchel and ran to Dora's bed. The violent, shifting colors were gone. Dora's skin was her normal, healthy tone. Her hair, which had been a sickly gray, was slowly, lazily shifting from a deep, resting brown to a soft, sleepy pink. Her breathing was deep and even. The void in her chest was gone, replaced by the warm, chaotic, beautiful hum of her own magic. Andromeda pressed her forehead to her daughter's, sobbing silently, her hands tangling in the pink hair. Narcissa walked to Draco. He was still pale, but the terrifying translucence was gone. The silver scar on his collarbone, the anchor point, was fading, turning into a normal, mundane blemish. He stirred, his eyelashes fluttering, and let out a soft, confused sigh. Narcissa sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand. She didn't cry. She just held his hand, feeling the steady, strong pulse of his magic, anchoring him to the world. Ted stood up and walked over to Andromeda, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. He looked over at Narcissa. "Did you do it?" Ted asked softly. Andromeda nodded against Dora's hair. "It's gone. It's all gone." Narcissa looked up, meeting Ted's eyes. "The machine is destroyed. The magic is returned. Dumbledore is exposed." Ted let out a long breath, a sound of profound relief. "Good. Now, who wants tea? Because I think we've earned the good leaves." Andromeda laughed, a wet, hiccuping sound. She turned in Ted's arms, kissing his cheek. "Tea sounds perfect." An hour later, the cottage was quiet. Dora and Draco were sleeping deeply, the healing sleep of the restored. Ted was in the kitchen, the smell of Earl Grey and toasted crumpets drifting down the hall. Andromeda and Narcissa sat in the living room, by the fire. They had cleaned themselves up, but they still wore their battle robes, too tired to change. Narcissa was holding a teacup, staring into the flames. "What happens now?" Narcissa asked quietly. "Lucius will know I was involved. The letter was from his library. He will see it as the ultimate betrayal." "Let him," Andromeda said, leaning her head back against the armchair. "He can't touch you. Not with the Order watching, not with the Ministry in an uproar. You're not just a Malfoy wife anymore, Chissa. You're the woman who helped bring down Dumbledore's shadow empire. You have power. Real power, not the borrowed kind." Narcissa took a sip of her tea. "I don't know who I am if I am not playing a role." "You're a black," Andromeda said. "You're a mother. You're my sister. That's enough to start with." Narcissa looked at her. The firelight caught the silver raven in her hair. "Will you teach me? The healing magic. The way you see the flow. I want to understand it. Not to control it, but to know it." "I'd like that," Andromeda smiled. "But you have to teach me how to carve obsidian without snapping my wand." "Deal." Narcissa set her cup down. She looked toward the hallway, where their children slept. "We declared war, Andy. And we won." "We didn't win," Andromeda said softly. "We just changed the rules. Dumbledore will adapt. The world will shift. But they won't do it in the dark anymore. And they won't do it to our kids." She reached out across the space between the chairs. Narcissa looked at her hand, then reached out and took it. Their fingers interlaced, the scars from the blood ritual pale and silver in the firelight. They sat in silence, two sisters who had spent 20 years apart, finally finding their way back to the same side of the board. The war for the greater balance was over. The work of simply living, of healing, of being whole, had just begun. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them was afraid of the dark. The end. Thank you for watching this video. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video.